Okay, so we will start the second part of chapter 19, which is the oxidative phosphorylation. Let's review of what we did in the last class, just so that we are fully together and can enjoy the rest of the chapter. So this is, you can see that this is inner mitochondrial membrane that actually is showing you respiratory chain, complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay. So just to review the complex 1 here, which is right here in the extreme left, right? NADH is the substrate, and excuse me, sorry about that. NADH is the substrate, and NADH actually transfers 2 electrons to a fat-soluble carrier, Q, also known as ubiquinone. And in that process, it picks up 2 protons from the matrix side and pumps 4 protons into the intermembrane space. Intermembrane space, what we call P side, is the space between the inner mitochondrial membrane and outer mitochondrial membrane, right? And this is the N side, which is the matrix side, right? Complex 2, succinate dehydrogenase, transfers 2 electrons to, again, ubiquinone. So you can see Q getting converted to QH2, lipid-soluble electron acceptor. So complex 1 and 2, you can see they are independent of each other, right? Complex 2 does not pump any proton into the intermembrane space, right? So both complex 1 and complex 2, the electrons are transferred to ubiquinone, right? And so the reduced form of ubiquinone, which will be QH2, that serves as a mobile carriers of electrons, right? And it passes those electrons to complex 3, which then, if you recall, through Q cycle, passes them to another mobile link, which will be cytochrome C, remember, water-soluble cytochrome C. And cytochrome C basically shuttles then those electrons 2 at a time to complex 4, right? And then complex 4 then transfers those electrons ultimately to molecular oxygen, reducing the molecular oxygen to water. And in that process, it also pumps 2 protons. So complex 3 as well pumps protons into the intermembrane space, as well as complex 4. So 1, 3, and 4 are the complexes of the respiratory chain that pump proton into the intermembrane space. Complex 2 does not. So that we talked at length how that happens at the individual levels in the last class. And here is the summary. When the electrons are being transferred from complex 1 to complex 4, you can see that the equation, when you write out, looks like this. And if you look at the right-hand side, you will see that 10 protons are pumped into the P space, right? And 11 protons are consumed in the N space. This is a balanced chemical equation. When electrons are transferred from complex 2 to complex 4, then you can see that in the P side, we are only pumping 6 protons, right? So because these protons actually go on to form the proton gradient into the intermembrane space, and that proton gradient moves downhill through F0, F1 synthase to generate ATP. You can see that when complex 1 is involved, you actually are pumping more protons, and therefore it will create more energy. And so that's why NADH on an average results into production of 1.5 molecules of ATP. Sorry, 2.5 molecules of ATP. Whereas FADH2, which starts out from complex 2, will only yield 1.5 molecules of ATP per molecule. Right, so that explains you why that mystery of why one NADH gives you 2.5 molecules of ATP, one FADH2 molecule gives you 1.5 molecules of ATP. Right. So with that, I want to actually talk a little bit about the coupling of the two processes, which is that of the electron transfer and the ATP synthesis that happens in the mitochondria. Okay. And so coupling means, the processes are linked. Can you do an experiment where you can actually demonstrate that the process of electron transfer is coupled to the ATP synthesis in mitochondria? Okay. So this is a very cool experiment people did. Mitochondria actually, you can actually isolate mitochondria and keep it alive in appropriate buffer. So you can do these experiments very easily in the laboratory. So when the scientists wanted to demonstrate this coupling of electron transfer and ATP synthesis in mitochondria, all they did was they actually took mitochondria and suspended that mitochondria in buffered medium, okay? And then what they did was they simply put in an oxygen sensor, oxygen electrode monitor that will actually tell you how much of oxygen is there in the buffer, how much is consumed, therefore you can calculate, right? And so what they did was they had the mitochondria suspended and they were trying to measure the oxygen consumed. And they could also do the experiment where they can also measure how much of ATP is synthesized. If ATP is synthesized by F0, F1 ATP synthase in mitochondria, you remember ATP, ADP translocase will move those ATP synthesized in the mitochondrial matrix into the cytoplasmic space, and that will eventually end up in the buffer, right? So you can take samples at different time and actually do an assay for ATP that has been synthesized in the buffer medium. That's how you measure. So in the red, you can see that the red line is ATP synthesized, and that's measured on the right-hand side of the y-axis. Oxygen consumed is on the left-hand side of the y-axis, and it's represented by the black line. So it's a very simple experiment to demonstrate that the coupling exists, right? And so what scientists then did was they actually added the ADP and inorganic phosphate, right? And if electron transfer was not important, or if it was not coupled to the process of ATP synthesis, then if you can imagine that ATP, when you added ADP and inorganic phosphate into the buffer, you will actually have ATP being synthesized, right? So it turns out that when they measured the oxygen consumed, there was no change in oxygen consumption, and there was no production of new ATP. Okay, there was a very basal level of oxygen consumption, very little slope you are seeing in that line, right? So when they add ADP and inorganic phosphate alone, it results in little or no increase in either respiration or ATP synthesis, right? But when you add an oxidizable substrate like succinate, then you can see that respiration begins. Respiration is consumption of oxygen, right? Respiration begins immediately, and then you also see as the respiration begins, ATP synthesis also begins. And if you add an inhibitor of complex 4, if you recall, cyanidine, right? Cyanidine will block the electron transfer between the cytochrome C oxidase and oxygen, molecular oxygen. Then you will see that both oxygen consumption totally stops and ATP synthesis completely stops. Okay, so when you cannot do the electron transfer, no respiration, no ATP synthesis, right? So that is a very clear demonstration of the process where electron transfer and ATP synthesis are coupled in mitochondria. Cool, right? Very easy to understand. Now, it turns out that they also wanted to demonstrate that mitochondrial respiration requires, oxidizable substrate, succinate, and ADP, and inorganic phosphate. Okay. So this one, they did the same experiment, right? They basically did exactly the same experiment. They wanted to demonstrate that respiration and ATP synthesis was coupled. So when they added the oxidizable substrate alone, like succinate, you think that, oh, succinate will get go to succinate dehydrogenase complex 2, and you might be able to synthesize ATP. But remember, succinate alone will not be able to actually produce any proton gradient on its own. But when the succinate is able to transfer its electron to quinone, then complex 3 and 4 will transfer some protons. But if you do not add any ADP and inorganic phosphate, succinate alone will not be able to actually fire up the respiration or ATP synthesis, right? So, so the mitochondria that is given with succinate can respire and synthesize ATP only when there is ADP and inorganic phosphate, right, added. But if you add like certain molecules like venturicidin, okay, venturicidin, these are like a group of antifungal compounds, okay, or oligomycin. Oligomycin is an antibiotic that actually acts by binding to ATP synthase so that it blocks the proton channel. So this is basically the mechanism by which oligomycin inhibits OXPHOS in bacteria. It's an antibiotic. But anyway, so if you add any of the two compounds, right, they will block both oxygen consumption and ATP synthesis, because venturicidin or oligomycin are the inhibitors of F0, F1 ATP synthase. They actually block the proton channel through F0 portion. I'll show you the structure of F0, F1 ATP synthase one more time today. So that makes sense. If you block the proton movement, you basically will block oxygen consumption and ATP synthesis. But there is another set of molecules that are pretty cool, okay, and they are called uncouplers. Okay, what are uncouplers? Uncouplers are these molecules that allows the respiration to continue without ATP synthesis. Okay, so DNP is one such uncoupler molecule. DNP stands for 2,4-dinitrophenol. Okay, structure is shown here on the right-hand side, top corner. Look at this plot first. I want you to focus here, right, on the left-hand side. Add DNP. Once you add DNP, it seems like oxygen consumption goes up, but ATP synthesis still doesn't begin. Interesting, right? What happens there? It basically is uncoupling the process of respiration to ATP synthesis. That's why it's called uncoupler. Okay, you can see that you can actually consume oxygen. You can continue to take molecular oxygen and transfer electrons to molecular oxygen to produce water. That means you can continue to burn fuel, right? But not synthesize any ATP. And that's why these molecules are called uncouplers, okay? And so it basically, water uncouplers, if you look here, there are two structures that are shown here, 2,4-dinitrophenol, DNP, and then FCCP. It's basically phenylhydrazone derivative. And if you look closely, you will see that proton, one proton in each molecule is shown in pink, and that's the proton that is dissociable proton, okay? At physiological pH, there is an equilibrium between protonated form and the unprotonated form as shown here in the right. So that is a dissociable proton, right? So both of these molecules, DNP and FCCP, have a dissociable proton, right? And if you notice, they are fairly hydrophobic, right? And because they are fairly hydrophobic, these two molecules can easily cross the inner mitochondrial membrane. Remember, the inner mitochondrial membrane is very, very picky. But because these molecules are fairly hydrophobic, they are able to cross the inner mitochondrial membrane. And when they cross the inner mitochondrial membrane, you know, what they will do is they will mess up the proton gradient that is actually created between the intermitochondrial space, right? And the cytoplasm. The N side and P side, the gradient that was generated between the N side and P side of the mitochondria is totally dissipated, which means destroyed. Why? Because these molecules will go in and they will be able to release the proton in the cytoplasm, and therefore they will screw up the gradient. Okay, so when the gradient, proton gradients is messed up, then there is no electrochemical energy stored, and therefore F0, F1 ATP synthase will not be able to be fired up because protons will not move through from outside to inside down their electrochemical gradient. And so that's why no synthesis of ATP will happen. Cool. So now you understand how these two molecules, uncouplers, can actually still continue respiration and not synthesize ATP. And there have been some, thinking along the lines, and people have worked and tried, is that you can use such molecules, such types of molecules to burn fat, right? If you are, let's say your cells do not need ATP, right? So you don't need to worry about ATP synthesis. But if you are able to bring fuel and burn it through regular processes, take those electrons and continue to transfer those electrons to molecular oxygen, right? You will be able to continue respiration, but you will not be able to, you will not need to synthesize ATP. So, but that's something just for you to know. It's pretty cool. All right. Now that brings me to a very, very interesting theory, which is this chemiosmotic theory, okay, chemiosmotic hypothesis, that basically was the first theory proposed by this Peter Mitchell, who was a British biochemist and got a Nobel Prize in 1978 because it discovered the mechanism by which ATP is synthesized, okay, from consumption of fuel. Okay, so by 1960s, you know, people knew that ATP was the energy currency of life, right? But they didn't know the mechanism by which the ATP was being produced. And they always thought that there could be a reaction, what they call substrate level phosphorylation type of reaction, in which you will have ADP molecule that will accept a phosphoryl group from a high energy intermediate. You know, high energy phosphorylated, high energy reactive intermediate. An example will be like, for example, phosphoenol pyruvate, if you recall, right? That can transfer a phosphoryl group to ADP, and then that's how you make ATP. That is what most of the scientists thinking were at that time. So, but it turns out that that was not the case. Peter Mitchell was the first one to suggest that it could be that the proton gradient across the inner mitochondrial membrane was the driving force for the ATP synthesis. And when we proposed that idea, he was of course ridiculed by most scientists, and in fact, it turned out that he was right. And it did win him a Nobel Prize. Okay, pretty cool, right? So to understand that, we need to actually look at some electrochemistry. And you know this already, but I still want to just show you so you know what could be going on. How proton gradient can act as the driving force for the synthesis of ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. It turns out that when you think about, in the center here is the inner mitochondrial membrane, okay? And they are showing you the N side, which will be the mitochondrial matrix side, and the P side, which is the intermembrane space, the space between the outer mitochondrial membrane and inner mitochondrial membrane. They're not showing you outer mitochondrial membrane here on the left, but they are showing you inner mitochondrial membrane, right? So it basically, this inner mitochondrial membrane separates the two compartments where you have different concentrations of proton, right? C2 concentration of, as shown here in the P side, and C1 concentration on the N side. But because these species is also charged, right? It's protons. It's not like benzene molecule, right? It's a charged species. So you can see that it has two components, right? One is chemical components, right? The concentration C1 and C2, and the other one is the charge component, right? Electrical component, right? One side will be more negatively charged, then the other side will be more positively charged. So if you want to understand the free energy that actually is stored in this type of system, then the free energy had two terms, okay? And those two terms are shown here. RT ln, concentration of C2 by C1. That's the first component. The second component is ZF delta psi, right? That's the charge component, the concentration component and the charge component. That concentration components can be also represented in the form of pH. So that's what they have done in the second line. So delta G is equal to 2.3 RT delta pH plus Faraday constant times delta F, delta psi. So these are the two components that will make up for the free energy for this system, okay? And this free energy is utilized when the proton flows from the P side to N side through F0, F1 synthase to synthesize ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. And this is all true, actually. You can literally measure the voltage, okay? If you measure the voltage across in the actively respiring mitochondria, delta psi is about 0.17 volt, 170 millivolt approximately. And the pH of the matrix is about 3/4 of a unit more alkaline, okay? So N side. So it is true, you can measure those. So that's how the energy is stored. That's what proton motive force has, okay? Okay, so going back to Peter Mitchell, osmotic theory of ATP synthesis is that, this is shown here in this figure, if you see, okay? So you can see that electrons from NADH or any other oxidizable substrates, right? They pass through a chain of carriers that are embedded into the inner mitochondrial matrix in a very asymmetric fashion. It's not like, any symmetry is there. They're non-uniformly distributed in the inner membrane, right? And so the electrons then flow through series of these complexes, right, via quinone, etc. And electron flow, that electron flow is accompanied by certain protons being pumped into the intermembrane space, and that produces both a chemical gradient, which will be represented by delta pH, and an electrical gradient that will be represented by delta psi of the previous slide, right? So both chemical potential and electrical potential contribute together as the driving force for the ATP synthesis, right? And so that's what they are showing you. You can see here nicely, beautifully, they're showing you positively charges being built up in the intermembrane space in the P side. And then eventually those protons will funnel through F naught, as shown here in the middle right-hand side. When those protons come in, F naught, F1, ATP synthase will do rotational catalysis, and I will show you in a little bit what is the detailed structure of that one is and where catalysis happens. But basically that proton movement down its electrochemical gradient will do this rotational catalysis, whereby bringing in ADP and inorganic phosphate to generate ATP molecule. Can you prove that by some other means? Right? And it turns out you can. You can literally impose an artificial electrochemical gradient in the intermembrane space. Forget about feeding mitochondria anything like oxidizable substrates like NADH or succinate or any such. But if you take a mitochondria and you are able to create a proton gradient, right, in the intermembrane space, you can still synthesize ATP from ADP and inorganic phosphate. As long as you provide ADP and inorganic phosphate, it will make ATP. So that's what an artificially imposed electrochemical gradient can drive the ATP synthesis in the absence in red, of an oxidizable substrates as electron donor. And that nails this chemiosmotic model that Peter Mitchell proposed of ATP synthesis. How cool this is, think about it, right? We didn't discuss it, how you can create artificial electrochemical gradient in the intermembrane space, but it's not something that we should worry about in this class. All right. So the question always is, how does a proton gradient drive the synthesis of ATP, right? And I have shown you the structure of F0, F1 ATP synthase early on in my lectures. F0 was named because, it gets inhibited by oligomycin. So that's why F0 comes, the naming comes. Many times, chemists and biologists have a little weird way of naming things. So F0 domain consists of 5 polypeptides. Those are alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and epsilon, and I'll show you them, how they are arranged. The F0 domain includes 3 hydrophobic subunits that are denoted by A, B, and C, and you see them in yellow. I'll just show you in a minute in the next slide. Okay, and it's the F0 that forms the transmembrane pore that allows the protons to move down their electrochemical gradient to drive ATP synthesis. Okay, and see these A and B subunits form the stator, and C unit forms the rotor. So this is what the structure of F0 F1 synthase looks like. Now this will take another at least half a class if I have to discuss how beautifully the enzymology of F0 F1 synthase is. How does it carry out this beautiful rotational catalysis, whereby it takes ADP and inorganic phosphate and makes ATP. But that's beyond the scope of this lecture, okay? But I want to show you that structure has been solved, and you can see that F1 domain is shown here, the ones that actually sitting in the mitochondrial matrix. And the F0 domain is mostly membrane with some actually domains also in the N side, matrix side. So on the right hand side, what I have done, I have shown you this picture upside down in my earlier class, but to keep things in perspective, I have just inverted it. So you can see what is going on here. We always tend to show you P side in the top, right? You see in all this picture, P side is on the top, N side is at the bottom. So it's best to show you in the correct context so you have a little less confusion, right? So if you look carefully, the F0 domain is shown here in yellow. So 10 of these C helices come together to form this rotor domain, okay? And A and B and delta, they form this what we call stator domain, okay? They literally rotate, and they're showing you by these red arrows here. As protons move, they rotate, okay? The F1 domain has this 3 alpha polypeptides, 3 beta polypeptides, 1 gamma central shaft, an epsilon that coordinates the interactions between the gamma and C domain of F0, and then this delta. And basically what happens is as proton flows through the membrane from the P side to the N side, right? Through F0, the cylinder and shaft, they rotate. And when they rotate, there is a conformational change, okay? And so the beta subunits of F1 then will actually bring in ADP and inorganic phosphate and convert them to ATP molecule. And so this is how ATP is synthesized. Proton moving down their electrochemical gradients, and 3 units of beta on the F1 domain will make ATP using ADP and inorganic phosphate. Okay, so I think that should almost make the picture complete for you at this stage, starting from glycolysis all the way, and now you have seen how you can synthesize ATP using this proton gradient that was generated as a result of electron transfer from the reducing equivalence. Now, I want you to think a little bit, okay? And the thinking is that if you recall in my earlier classes, I had mentioned that the concentration of NADH is typically 100,000-fold higher in mitochondria than in the cytosol. Remember that? Again, concentration of NADH is 100,000 times higher in mitochondria than in cytosol. That's something that I told you, okay? And so, and if you are struggling to see where I showed you that, I can go back and show you what I am referring to. Remember this slide? Yes. Okay. So with that, I will go back to what we want to actually talk about here. So you know that NADH concentration is 100,000 higher in mitochondria than in cytosol. But you want to know very curiously, most NADH that are utilized in electron transport chain is cytosolic in nature. People have done labeling experiments and they have proved it, okay? And it turns out that NADH does not cross the inner mitochondrial membrane. It doesn't have any, transporter, specialized transporter that will allow it to actually leave the inner mitochondrial membrane and come out. Very curious problem. Most NADH used in electron transport is cytosolic. Oh, interesting. Therefore, they must be brought in the mitochondrial matrix somehow. Then only they can transfer those electrons to NADH dehydrogenase complex 1, right? So, and NADH doesn't cross the inner mitochondrial membrane on its own. So that's the trouble. So how do they come from cytosol to mitochondrial matrix? It turns out that there are two shuttle systems are there that affect this movement of electrons from NADH without actually carrying NADH from outside to inside. They are carrying the equivalence of electron, two electrons, two reducing equivalents. One reducing equivalent would be one electron. Two reducing equivalents will be two electrons, an electron pair that is there in NADH, right? So just think about it. Okay, so it's not NADH itself moving into mitochondrial matrix, but somehow those two electrons are being brought into the mitochondrial matrix without actually carrying the NADH. You can digest that, right? So the first shuttle system is called glycerophosphate shuttle system, okay, that utilizes glycerol 3-phosphate chemistry, okay, to bring those two reducing equivalents from NADH from the cytosol into the mitochondrial matrix. And I will show you that how. And the second one is this malate aspartate shuttle that uses malate to carry electrons across the membrane. Cool? So how does it work? This glycerol 3-phosphate shuttle system primarily operates in the skeletal muscles and the brain. Okay? Very important. This shuttle system primarily operates in skeletal muscles, which could be carrying out very active glycolysis, and brain, which utilizes a lot of sugar for fuel, right? So what happens? What happens here, right? So if you look here, they're showing you the P side. P side is in intermembrane space, right? Remember, outer mitochondrial membrane is pretty leaky. It allows certain things to come in and out. NADH is able to come into the intermembrane space without any problem. Outer mitochondrial membrane is will allow that NADH to come, right? So in the cytosol or in the intermembrane space, right, you have this enzyme called cytosolic isoform of glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Okay, so you have two isoforms of glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme. One is cytosolic, which hangs around in the intermembrane space and cytosol. And the other one is mitochondrial isoform. Okay, and you'll see the chemistry is slightly different. When you are producing NADH, let's say as a result of glycolysis, right? That NADH will transfer a hydride ion from itself to a molecule that you are familiar with, dihydroxyacetone phosphate. See dihydroxyacetone phosphate. You can see dihydroxy, one of the hydroxy group has a phosphoryl group, right? That's why dihydroxyacetone, you can see acetone molecule, right? So dihydroxyacetone phosphate and NADH will be the substrate for the cytosolic isoform of glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Convert those two molecules into glycerol 3-phosphate and NAD+. Okay. Now, once you have glycerol 3-phosphate, that becomes a substrate for the mitochondrial glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Mitochondrial glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase is bound to the outer face of the inner mitochondrial membrane. It is again bound to the outer face of the inner mitochondrial membrane. And so what it will do is, it will take glycerol 3-phosphate and transfer, basically oxidize it using FAD. Okay. And thereby generating FADH2 and back to dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Dihydroxyacetone phosphate then can go on and bring another equivalent of NADH this way. This cycle can keep on going infinitely if needed. And that FADH2, right? This mitochondrial glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase is actually a flavin-linked respiratory chain dehydrogenase, right? It's also embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane that will take glycerol 3-phosphate and oxidize it to generate dihydroxyacetone phosphate, right? With the concurrent reduction of FAD to FADH2. And that FADH2 will then transfer electrons to coenzyme Q. So therefore, you are generating reduced form of ubiquinol. So mitochondrial glycerol 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, where what chemistry it's doing, it's taking glycerol 3-phosphate, oxidizing it to dihydroxyacetone phosphate using FAD. Then it is taking the reduced FADH2 and transferring those electrons to reducing equivalents, 1 electron pair, 2 electrons to ubiquinone to generate reduced ubiquinone, which is ubiquinol. And then that can go to complex 3. Cool? So that's what it does. Now this system, turns out, produces only 1.5 molecules of ATP per NADH. And think about it, why that would be. Just think. You just learned that each molecule of NADH on an average gives you 2.5 molecules of ATP. But if you remember, that NADH must go through complex 1 and pump some protons into the intermembrane space. That's not what is going on here in this glycerophosphate shuttle, right? Instead, the electrons are directly transferred to reduced form of ubiquinone and goes to complex 3, right? So you lost those protons from complex 1. Because NADH does not go through complex 1, rather it transfers these reducing equivalents, from NADH to ubiquinone into complex 3, it only produces 1.5 molecules of ATP, right? Okay, so this glycerophosphate shuttle couples cytosolic oxidation of NADH with mitochondrial reduction of FAD. And this shuttle system operates in skeletal muscles and brains where you'll have tons of NADH molecules. Very, very cool, right? What happens to the second shuttle system, which is the mylate aspartate shuttle? It is a busy slide, but I will walk you through it so you can see most of the reactions, you know this already. So it will all make sense to you, I promise. This shuttle system primarily works in the liver, kidney, and the heart muscles. And it does produce 2.5 ATP molecule per NADH. How do you bring NADH from the cytosol to mitochondrial matrix using mylate aspartate shuttle? It's a reversible shuttle system where if you look on the left-hand side, what they are trying to do is they are trying to bring the equivalent of 1 mole of NADH into inside the mitochondrial matrix. Okay. What happens the reaction number 1 here? You can see that NADH plus oxaloacetate that will sit in the intermembrane space will get converted using mylate dehydrogenase to mylate, right? So NADH in the cytosol or intermembrane space will pass 2 reducing equivalents, which will be 1 electron pair, to oxaloacetate producing mylate. Mylate then comes into mitochondrial matrix via mylate alpha ketoglutarate transporter. Okay, so it will bring mylate in and alpha ketoglutarate will go out. It's an anti-Porter system. So once mylate comes in, remember you have mylate transporter. You know this already. I have talked to you about this, right? So in the matrix, what happens is mylate will then do the opposite reaction because you have a mitochondrial isoform of mylate dehydrogenase. It will take mylate and NAD plus and regenerate NADH. In that process, you will regenerate oxaloacetate in the mitochondrial matrix. So you literally were able to bring an equivalent of NADH from outside to inside without physically transferring NADH through any transporter. That's what happened here. Cool, right? And now I will draw your attention to the reactions that we studied during the urea cycle. Not necessarily, the urea cycle reaction 1 through 4, but it is part of the reactions that were utilized to make urea, right? Remember aspartate aminotransferase reaction, where you actually were taking oxaloacetate and glutamate in the mitochondrial matrix, and you were actually generating alpha ketoglutarate, and that amine group was embedded in the form of aspartate. Remember the urea cycle discussion? Yeah, the same. The aspartate actually comes out into the intermembrane space. You remember the same type of reaction is happening in the when we discuss the reactions of the urea cycle on that slide. Yeah, it's the same one. So aspartate will actually come out, right? And it comes out through glutamate aspartate transporter system. And so once you bring aspartate, right, out, you can regenerate oxaloacetate by the transamination reaction of aspartate aminotransferase, and you can continue this cycle. You can bring infinite number of NADH molecule from outside to inside by just running it into the cycle, right? How beautiful this is. Think about it. Now this is able to generate 2.5 molecules of ATP per NADH because whatever NADH you are generating here can actually go through complex 1, right? So that's how this mylate aspartate shuttle system works. That brings me to almost last slide here, where we talk about ATP producing pathways, how they're regulated. Okay, so if you look here, all these reactions you have seen, glycolysis on the top, some of the key enzymes, especially the ones that carry out or catalyze irreversible steps under cellular conditions. They are tightly regulated by allosteric ligands. Sometimes you have the feedback mechanism, right? So for example, hexokinase can be inhibited by its own product, glucose 6-phosphate. If it is not being channeled into the pathways going down here, if it accumulates, then it will go and bind to the allosteric site of hexokinase and inhibit the activity of hexokinase. So you no longer produce glucose 6-phosphate. Okay. But eventually you are seeing here that glucose you can take all the way, run through glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and then feed the energy into oxidative phosphorylation, the reducing equivalents, and in that process generate ATP. So oxidative phosphorylation is regulated by the cellular energy demand, okay, which depends on the mass action ratio of ATP to ADP and inorganic phosphate. Okay. And so the rate of oxidation of cellular fuel is regulated with very high sensitivity and precision. Okay, so it really, you know, so what I mean by that is that the ratio of ATP concentration to ADP and inorganic phosphate, that mass action ratio, fluctuates very little in most tissues, even when you are actually doing, you know, rigorous exercise, physical exercise. Even during extreme variations in energy demand, the ratio varies very little. And that little variation alone is enough to regulate the production of ATP. What that also means is that ATP is formed only as fast as it is being demanded or utilized in energy requiring cellular activities. It's not like you make lots of ATP, cells are going to make a lot of ATP, and here it is, whenever cells you want to use it, use it. That's not how it works. So extreme variations in energy demand still maintains, not I won't say maintains, but there is a little variations in the ratio of ATP to ADP in inorganic phosphate. Cells are very sensitive to that. And so they will make ATP, they will sense that, and they will make ATP as fast as the cells are able to consume them, right? And so rate of respiration, oxygen consumption in mitochondria is also very tightly regulated. It will depend on how many molecules of ADP exist. If there are more and more number of ADP molecules, right, that actually would be needed to make ATP, then that will activate cellular respiration here, oxidative phosphorylation. Okay. And in certain types of hypoxic cells, cells that don't have molecular oxygen, we have mechanism by which a protein inhibitor will go and block the ATP hydrolysis activity of ATP synthase. Okay, remember F0, F1 ATP synthase and F0, F1 ATPase. Those are the same family of enzymes. One will hydrolyze ATP and the other one will synthesize. In other reaction, it will synthesize, right? So if your cells are actually hypoxic, you know, hypoxia is a very bad condition. Your brain cells cannot live without even oxygen for even small amount. So there are mechanisms to protect so that those cells don't utilize ATP hydrolyzing reactions. There is a protein inhibitor that will block them so that cells still thrive in the hypoxic environment. So I think I have, you know, most of these reactions, you know, I just want you to go back and look at them and say that it does make sense. The red X means that those are inhibitors. The green triangle is activator, right? So the rate of oxidation of cellular fuel is regulated with high sensitivity and precision in such that ATP and ADP, ratio of ATP to ADP and inorganic phosphate fluctuates very little in most tissues, even during extreme variations in energy demand. And so it is formed, ATP is formed only as fast as it can be utilized in energy requiring processes. And rate of respiration in mitochondria is also tightly regulated. It is generally limited by the availability of ADP as a substrate for phosphorylation. And so with that, I think we have finished this chapter. Let me stop recording here. And